Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Okay, welcome again everyone to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select both panelists and attendees when responding so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions that you may have during the conversation into the Q&A box. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording, as well as any resources that you see shared as links in the chat, will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Additionally, I would like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Later today at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we invite you to join us for a session focused on taking stock and looking forward, principles on K-3 learning. Next week, we invite you to finish off the month of April with us for a session focused on starting early, state investments that support children's language and literacy development. On May 3rd, we have an exciting session at 3 p.m. on seizing the moment, closing the digital equity gap, and the following week, a Crucible of Practice salon focused on CGLR communities and Strive Together. Registration and more information will be posted in the chat box, and we hope you can join us. Lastly, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming Housing as a Platform webinar. This will take place tomorrow, April 20th, from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be featuring the Akron Metropolitan Housing Authority and their engagement with parents as teachers in a session titled Parents as Critical Partners. Again, registration and information will be posted in the chat box now. Joining me now is Ginger Young, consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra. It is great to be here today, and I'm delighted to see everyone who's joined us. Welcome to today's Funder to Funder webinar, Building Hope and Opportunity, Philanthropy's Role in Catalyzing Children's Savings Accounts. This is actually the second in a series of 2 webinars on children's savings accounts. CGLR held the first, Children's Savings Accounts Building Wealth, Aspirations, and Prosperity for Children and Families, on March 29th. It was a terrific, wide-ranging discussion that I had the honor of moderating. Today's session is an important next installment in the conversation around children's savings accounts, specifically geared to the funder community, and the ways that you can lift up CSAs as a 2-generation driver of hope, opportunity, asset building, and educational aspirations and attainment. It is my delight now to introduce you to our speakers. We have an amazing collection of CSA talent with us today. Sterling Sparren will moderate today's session. Sterling is currently serving as interim president and CEO of the Maine Community Foundation. His own experiences with Children's Savings Account, which we will refer to today as CSAs, came in large part from his time as president and CEO of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation from 2006 to 2013, and in earlier roles he held with the Peninsula Community Foundation. Sterling also co-founded Raising a Reader, where today he serves on the board. Perhaps his most important role was his very first. He began his career as a 7th and 8th grade English teacher in Cleveland, Ohio. Our 2 presenters today are Carl Rist and Rebecca Loya. Carl was with us for the March 29th webinar. Welcome back, Carl. Carl is an independent consultant based in Durham, North Carolina, and a former senior fellow at Prosperity Now. Carl has a deep and decades-long history with CSAs. Rebecca Loya is a research scientist at the Institute for Economic and Racial Equity at Brandeis University's Heller School for Social Policy and Management, where she has studied CSAs and other asset building programs for more than a decade. We will also get to participate and hear from two people who have been very much involved in this field in their roles as funders, a conversation between Benita Melton and Patty Grant. Benita is a Michigan native who serves as director of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation's education program. Benita has been with the Mott Foundation for more than 20 years. Patty Grant, who was also with us for the March 29th webinar, serves as executive director of the Community Foundation of Wabash County in Indiana. Patty has held various roles with the Community Foundation since 1989. You can find links to the full bios for each of these 5 speakers today in the chat. And now it is my delight to welcome to today's webinar our moderator, Sterling Sparren. Welcome, Sterling.
Thank you, Ginger, and welcome everybody. I must say, for the last 2 years, I've been on the other side of this camera. I have attended so many campaign for grade level reading webinars in the last 2 years. That's what's kept me sane during the Zoom time. So it's fun to be with you all today. I've got a few prepared remarks, and I want to do a little history lesson because every funder finds his or her way to this work through various paths. But one of the reasons we're delighted to present the webinar today is that CSAs provide a wide opportunity for an array of funders on how to get involved. You'll hear, as Ginger said, from a private foundation in Benita Melton at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation and Patty Grant at a community foundation in Indiana. And I'll be very interested to hear how their relationship has developed around CSAs. The field is rapidly growing, but I mentioned in planning the webinar that in Silicon Valley, there's an old saying that says it takes at least 20 years to be an overnight success. And when you look at the history of the CSA movement, it's interesting to see that it may be, thanks to the campaign, that CSAs are ready to really take off in this field. I've got a few special points for community foundations because we think donor advisors could be a tremendous resource for investing in CSAs going forward. A few personal reflections. 30 years ago, 1992, Michael Sheridan published his book, Assets for the Poor. In 1993, Walter Annenberg announced a $500 million gift to challenge the field to reform K-12 public education. In 1994, the Carnegie Corporation published its groundbreaking report, Starting Points, which for the first time started to draw attention to early childhood brain development and a quiet crisis because of a lack of good quality childcare for working parents. Then finally, in 1997, on the cover of Time magazine, a little baby with the headline, How a Child's Brain Develops. Wow. At that point, I'd been at Peninsula Community Foundation for 6 or 7 years, and I'd seen lots of people try to reform K-12 education, but I was fascinated at the power of early childhood, and we started talking about the first 5 years. And we used that term a lot long before the California Prop 10 Commission took it over and later nationally. But about that time, a young woman who was a recent Stanford MBA and an Echoing Green Fellow, Audrey Seymour, walked into my office. And she said, how about we start an initiative focusing on kids from birth to age 8? And for many of you, the arguments about whether it's 0 to 3 or universal pre-K or the first 4 years of school, we adopted a 0 to 8 framework pretty early on. And then I went to an affinity group for funders in children, youth, and families. And I met Bob Friedman, who presented the concept of individual development accounts. And I sat in that workshop and I thought, so many of the things philanthropy deals with are the symptoms and results of poverty, but we rarely get to go right to the heart of poverty, which is a lack of financial assets and underdeveloped human capital. Well, it took me a few years to take that idea and make it happen. But when we started the Center for Venture Philanthropy at Peninsula Community Foundation, we said we were going to incubate new projects, and we didn't have to be innovative. We just had to go find the best ideas and try to take them to scale. At the same time, we started raising a reader because we knew that early childhood, all the evidence showed that those kids who shared books and fell in love with reading at a very early age had no problem learning how to read when they walked into kindergarten or pre-K if they had a familiarity with books and how books work. Well, we met a new donor couple who had opened up a donor advised fund about that time. And we asked them about their history, where they grew up, what issues they cared about. And at one point, the couple, he had made his fortune in transforming the financial services industry, and she was a former elementary school teacher. And he said, well, what are you doing, Sterling? And I said, well, we're actually starting two programs, an individual development account program, which helps working families save for education, to buy a home, to start a business or retirement. And we're starting Raising a Reader because we know not enough kids are getting read to, and it's not just the lack of books, it's family engagement. 2 weeks later, the donor called up and he said, Sterling, we're going to put $500,000 into Raising a Reader and $500,000 into the individual development account, the Assets for All Alliance, which eventually became the largest IDA program in the country. Well, that gave me a great close relationship with the Corporation for Enterprise Development, which is now Prosperity Now. So when I arrived at the Kellogg Foundation in 2006, the CSA program was really taking off and replacing IDAs as the go-to financial strategy. So I was delighted to work with Carl Rist and then Andrea Levere at Prosperity Now to support the field and how the field has grown. And thanks to the campaign today, we're going to get a deep dive into where the CSA movement is at and where it's going to go. So with that, Carl, I want to turn it over to you to give us the background. Some of you may have seen some of this on March 29th, but it's always a refresher. And it's exciting because if this field's going to take off, we have no question the proof of concept has been proven. Carl.
Hey, Sterling, great to see you. Thanks so much for the introduction there. You covered so much of what I want to cover, so this will be a great refresher for folks on the call. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar, and or as the case may be, listening to the recording at a later date. As Sterling said, my name is Carl Rist, and it's been my absolute pleasure to be part of the launching and growth of the CSA field for over the last 2 decades. As Sterling said, we're an overnight success now, right? And that was first on the staff of Prosperity Now, but more recently in my role as a consultant with the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, and my great colleague Benita, you'll hear from a little bit later today. We have a great lineup of panelists, so my job as the opening presenter is to do some level setting. I know that some of you are already familiar with CSAs, and some of you may have been on or seen the webinar last month, so I apologize if this is a review for you. But for others, this may be a new conversation, so I want to make sure that we start out with a good starting point and a high-level overview of CSAs so we're all on the same page. So I'm going to talk about what CSAs are, how they work, why they're important, and just how big the CSA field is here in 2022 as we become an overnight sensation. So next slide. So first off, what are children's savings accounts? I think it's worth noting at the outset here that a CSA, also known in some circles as a child development account, is not a term of art. So there's not one specific definition as you have maybe with an IRA or a 401k account. Rather, CSAs include a range of closely related initiatives that all embody a set of key features that you'll see here on the screen. So first, CSAs are long-term savings or investment accounts for children or youth with a focus really on the long term. Many CSA programs establish accounts when children are born. So we're talking about long-term accounts that may be open for as many as 18 years or even more. Second, CSAs typically are designed to help participants save for a specific long-term asset, some of the ones that Sterling just mentioned. In most cases with CSAs, programs help children and youth or families save for post-secondary education. That's really the main use at this point in the CSA field. Third, what's unique about CSAs and what really distinguishes them from maybe a basic savings account for children and youth you might find at a bank or a credit union is that the accounts receive one or more monetary incentives to help the savers save and the accounts to grow. And this may come in the form of initial deposits to help establish the account. It may come in the form of savings matches to encourage participants to save in the account. And it may come in the form of behavioral incentives or benchmark deposits to encourage specific behaviors like doing well in school or taking a financial education course or even signing up for direct deposit into your account. And then finally, in return for these incentives, most CSA programs restrict the savings in the account to some specific asset building use. And again, it's most frequently post-secondary education, but in some cases it may be long-term investing in home ownership or starting a business. All right, let's go to the next slide. So why are children's savings accounts so important? And this gets back in some ways to what Sterling was saying about how you're really getting to the heart of poverty. So CSAs are very much built on theory and research, about what it takes for families to get ahead and to stay ahead. Much of our social policy in this country is focused on helping households to have enough income to make it month to month. But a new wave of researchers led by Michael Sheridan at Washington University, and again, the author of Assets and the Poor that I think was already cited in the chat and that Sterling mentioned, these researchers have pointed out that households get ahead and stay ahead by having assets, wealth, or resources that they own. In fact, while wealth and income are all forms of money, the reality is that assets, and we're talking about things like savings accounts, mutual funds, stocks and bonds, retirement accounts, these all function somewhat differently than income. So for example, assets are flexible and can be used both for long-term investments and the kind of things we've been talking about, homes, education, small business, but they can also be used to cushion or cover families in a short-term emergency. Another thing is that assets are durable and can be passed from one generation to the next in a way that you really can't pass your paycheck on. But while assets are important for success in our market economy, the truly ugly reality of 21st century America is that the distribution of wealth in our country is highly unequal, even much more so than income. As the graph on your screen shows, according to the most recently available data, the wealth, and we're talking assets minus liabilities, of the average or median white household is more than $170,000, which is 10 times greater than the median wealth of Black households and 8 times greater than the median wealth of Hispanic households. With a staggering level of inequality, building wealth is a critical avenue for building hope and opportunity for all families in our country. So next slide. So how do CSA programs work? So for the most part, children's savings account programs are set up and managed by public or nonprofit organizations. These programs open an account for children and or youth, and the most common types of accounts are either regular bank accounts or 5 to 9 college savings accounts. In some cases, CSA programs focus on a particular target population, but more common are programs in which children in a specific geographic area, that whether a neighborhood, a city, or state, are eligible, and even in some cases even automatically enrolled in CSAs. As I mentioned earlier, these programs provide one or more incentives to help the accounts grow. Again, initial deposits, savings matches, or other incentives. And given the wealth inequality we just talked about, another common practice is to provide progressive incentives so that low-income kids receive greater benefits. Along with the accounts and the incentives, CSA programs often provide some kind of basic financial education to help children and families understand how to save, how to manage their account, and how to wisely use their account proceeds. And then in the end, the beneficiaries have a nest egg they can use at age 18 to invest in an asset. And as I mentioned earlier, and as Patty will talk about, for example, later on the call, the vast majority of CSA programs, for them, this means being able to help their students, their savers, pay for post-secondary education. So I want to say a little bit about how big the field is and how again in the 2 decades how we've become an overnight sensation and how big things are. So the CSA field has grown rapidly since launching as a demonstration back in 2002. As of the end of 2021, and these are sort of unofficial numbers, but I can give you the numbers. There were more than 100 programs, big and small, across 36 states, and those programs had established more than 1 million CSAs for kids. I should also do a quick plug right now. There's going to be a webinar on May 17th by my former colleagues at Prosperity Now that's going to provide the most recent data on 2021 as of the end of the year, how big the field is. But again, you're getting sort of a preview right here. As you can see on these maps, much of the CSA activity has been in the Northeast and West in states like Maine, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, where every child or kindergarten student receives a CSA. But there's also been a lot of activity at the local level in places like the Bay Area, the Twin Cities, and across Michigan and Indiana. So finally, on this last slide, I want to say a few things about some of the key milestones that have marked the growth of the field. Again, we keep getting back to this overnight sensation notion, but as I mentioned previously, as a programmatic and policy innovation, the field is really only 2 decades old. And it all started with a national demonstration known as the SEED demonstration that lasted from 2002 to 2009 to test the efficacy of CSAs and was supported, I should say, 100% by large national foundations that really provided the seed money to really test out and begin the dramatic growth of this movement. Since the end of the seed demonstration, a number of key developments have helped to propel the field forward. First, in 2011, San Francisco became the first city to enroll all incoming kindergarten students automatically in a CSA program known as kindergarten to college. San Francisco now enrolls almost 4,000 kindergarten students annually in K2C. And I should say too, the first savers in K2C will become high school seniors this year. So we've got a whole wave of kids in San Francisco that have been saving, and we're going to learn a lot more in the coming years very shortly about how the impact of CSA, having a CSA, what that account has done for both their financial wherewithal to go to post-secondary, but also how it's changed their perspective on going to college. In 2013, the state of Maine became the first to automatically enroll all newborns in a CSA. Maine is somewhat unique in that its key statewide funder, the Harold Alfond Foundation, had been offering parents of newborns a generous $500 if they open a 529 college savings account for their child. In 2013, though, state leaders flipped this around and acted to make this automatic so that all newborns in the state would be included. And so now more than 13,000 Maine babies annually receive a $500 starter deposit in a CSA. New York City is also another good example of the role of private philanthropy in sparking large-scale change. For several years, with the support of the Gray Foundation, and I think I noticed in the chat, there's someone from the Gray Foundation on the call today, so thanks for joining us. So the Gray Foundation helped to support Kids Rise, New York City Kids Rise, which opened for several years more than 3,000 accounts a year for incoming kindergarten students in one school district in Queens. But then just last year, then New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced the citywide expansion of Kids Rise, so that now each fall, 70,000 New York City kindergarten students will receive a $100 starter deposit in a CSA to save for college. These are just a few of the key milestones from in the field. And as you can see on the screen, a number of cities and states now open CSAs, and in some cases automatically, for all children in that state or city. And these larger scale efforts have driven much of the growth you see on the graph on the screen. And again, I should say that, so these numbers here are through 2020. To get the 2021 numbers, join that webinar on May 17th, and you'll see that the field has now grown to more than 1 million accounts, which is fabulous for our first 2 decades. Let me close just by saying that the vision for CSAs, for the CSA field is large, but I don't want to scare anyone off and think you've got to go big right from the get-go. The truth is that many programs like New York City Kids Rise start smaller, demonstrate success, and then grow from there. So with that brief introduction to the CSA field, let me turn things back to Sterling. And again, thank you all for joining our call today.
Thank you, Carl. We are right on time and with so much to cover. I'm now excited to bring Benita and Patty into the conversation, and with specific questions for both of you on how at Charles Stewart Mott, Benita, did you come to the field of CSAs, and why have you stayed involved? And you've been in the education field for so long. I'm very curious how CSAs first appeared on your radar. And then I know you have this amazing partnership with Patty Grant, who right down there at the retail level is doing a lot of innovative stuff with CSAs in Indiana. So let me turn it over to the two of you. And Benita, if you'd go first.
Certainly, thank you very much. Great overview, Carl. As always, you teed us up nicely. So the story of how we got into children's savings accounts has a lot of elements to it. Part of it is the idea, and part of it is people, and that's a philosophy that we have at the foundation for how we've approached grant making. I remember when I interviewed at the foundation many, many moons ago, and I asked our former president and CEO and chair of the board, Bill White, what makes a good grant. And he said half of it, 50% is people and 50% of it is the idea. And we had both of those in children's savings accounts. It was also the style of grant making that we were doing at the time, not that we have a hard and fast approach to the way we do grant making, but at that time we were doing demonstrations and pilots, trying to, as Sterling pointed out, proof of concept of ideas. One of my colleagues used to refer to our style of grant making as farm team Farm League for the federal government. So philanthropy being risk capital, testing ideas, and then hoping that they would be scaled by government, by federal and state governments in particular. And then last but not least, I would say that partnership with some of the organizations we had worked with. Carl mentioned Prosperity Now. Back then, they were the Corporation for Enterprise Development. We had worked with them for years on other ideas, including microenterprise. And so when Michael Sheridan and Bob Friedman came to us with the next new big idea, the partnership played heavy into us joining into that. I think the more interesting question is why we've stayed in children's savings accounts. Part of that is the demonstration project that we funded. The initial findings were very compelling. The stories and the narrative and the data that we were seeing, including one of the data points that has defined this field when we started, a belief that low and moderate income families couldn't save money. And that was wildly disproven in the demonstration, the seed demonstration. And there were other data points like that that let us know we were on to something. There's the potential around 2012, Dr. Willie Elliott, who was on the previous webinar, his research showing the potential asset effects on education. That was another sort of avenue that opened up around this idea that we wanted to explore. So the opportunity to have that impact was compelling for us. And then there was the momentum and the progress being made. Our goal was to try to help the idea catch fire, and it was just starting to spark maybe. And so we wanted to stay with it. To the point Sterling made, change takes time, and it doesn't happen in 3-year, 5-year program plans. And that's one of the identifying characteristics I like most about the Mott Foundation, is that we stick with ideas so that we can have an impact and make change, and that change is sustainable and long-term. One of the last reasons that we stayed in is the same for why we got in: partnerships. We've made some great partners over time, and I think part of how we have an impact our relationships and partnerships and working together. And I'll use that as a way to hand it off to Patty.
Thank you, Benita. I want to thank the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for joining me. And I too appreciated Sterling's review of this march to CSAs, and certainly recognize the Mott Foundation and Benita for assisting us with our innovation and work in this field. I am a big believer and think that this is something that all community foundations can embrace. The rewards are great. Thinking, as Carl did, that perhaps some of you were not on the previous webinar, I just want to briefly review what our CSA program is. Our model is about innovating an alternative method for delivering post-secondary scholarships. We provide through the CSA platform for our students to engage in the savings accounts in a manner that is not solely dependent upon savings. Students and families' engagement with these CSA accounts is developed through students in school learning and in school engagement. So here's how it works, just briefly. We use the CSA platform to award small scholarships frequently to students who are in grades 4 through 8, who complete 100% of their in-school assignments at a 70% proficiency. How frequently do we award those awards? Quarterly. It's important to note that we award learning behaviors that our teachers have told us will lead to student learning. So rather than providing a $20 scholarship for a grade at the end of the school year, we award a $10 scholarship into the CSA each time the student completes their schoolwork in math or reading or language arts. We also do award small scholarships when students learn and set adaptive learning goals and meet those adaptive learning goals. As the children progresses through our program, we shift our attention from in-school awards for academic achievements to college prep activities, such as completing a college cost estimator, visiting a campus, or writing a college essay. And we do matching for savings as well. If the students in our program complete all of their schoolwork and their college prep activities, they can earn up to $1,000 over the 5-year program. The early award scholarships are invested just as the 529 funds are and are available for payment directly to the student's choice of a post-secondary institution up until the age of 26. This work aligned with the mission of the Community Foundation to advance educational attainment. As Sterling pointed out, community foundations often are involved in making grants that alleviate the suffering that's caused by poverty and low income and low literacy. But this platform provided for us a meaningful way beyond just the financial impact of helping our families and our students embrace educational attainment and think differently about their futures. It aligns with our mission to address the quality of life and incomes and educational attainment. In particular, we saw this as a perfect complement to our traditional scholarships. Like many community foundations, we do engage many donors and have multiple scholarship funds, some of which are very large. But we would note for year after year after year that we would award scholarships to low income and needy children, and the scholarships would go undistributed. And that is a matter that the CSA program can address, preparedness, because CSAs can address identity, in-school engagement, and savings as well impacting both parent expectation and a children's orientation to how they think about their future as education dependent. Given this alignment, we use our own discretionary funds to fund our scholarships. We also have been generously supported through our donor advised funds. And in addition to that, we always talk to anyone who walks in our doors that wants to start a scholarship fund, a traditional scholarship fund. As grateful as we are for those powerful assets, we always encourage them to think differently, that perhaps they could use the very same money to reach the very same children early in the 4th grade or in the 3rd grade, which we believe could be more impactful in terms of increasing their identity, changing their orientation to education and learning at a younger age, and removing some of the financial barriers. So that's our CSA program, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Let me ask you, Patty, tell us when did you first hear about children's savings accounts? What got your interest?
We were blessed here in Wabash County by an innovative YMCA director and a partner superintendent. And in addressing the YMCA's goal to narrow the achievement gap, they made it a goal to enroll every K through 3rd grader in Wabash County with a 529. They launched that program in 2013, and we funded the development of the program and created a partnership with the Y to do that work. And by 2016, over 65% of the kids in Wabash County had a 529, which provided a rich platform to then say, how can we use this platform to do what we had long mused about? How do you give a 4th grader a scholarship? Unfortunately, they likely will spend it on bubble gum or something that's, next to their heart right now, right? So with that rich platform of CSAs in Wabash County, in being introduced to the Mott Foundation and their commitment to CSAs, it was an easy next step. What if we took money and awarded a 4th grader for learning how to read? And that's what we're attempting to do.
So if I understand this, a social entrepreneur at the Y first came to you and said, we've got this idea. You were a responsive funder, but then how is your connection to Mott? And also, I appreciate you're giving those fourth graders the marshmallow test. Like, are they gonna eat it, or are they gonna save for their future? But how did you meet Benita and the Mott Foundation?
But Benita, would you like to answer that?
Go ahead, Patty.
Well, the social entrepreneur at the YMCA didn't stop at Wabash County. They developed what became Promise Indiana and sought to blanket the state of Indiana, all 95 counties, with a promise program. And in this case, the promise was setting up a 529. And the superintendent and the YMCA director, his name is Clint Kugler, convened a group of county leaders throughout Indiana at our local university, which I attended, and met Benita, who was also attending it to learn more and to promote 529s. And Benita and I had a conversation about what if we changed the way traditional scholarships are delivered, not replace it, but to complement it, and use the power of CSAs to change the orientation of children's thinking to the future. I have a future, I have a fund, I have an account. Education is for me. It is for me. It's not for somebody else. And I would add all the CSA and the work that Clint did and that we do in the manner in which we've devised this program is based on the work of Daphne Oyserman for identity-based motivation theory. We use some of the pieces and the parts to make sure that we are connecting with identity and shaping it not only by the individual, but in the classroom, and working with the teachers to talk to the kids about having these funds. So, but we're indebted to Mott. They took a risk on us, and we really appreciate it.
And I would just say right back at you, Patty, because we've been working to try to innovate on this idea and find best practice. You know, a big part of what we've been doing is strengthening program design and implementation, so that the impacts and the promise and the potential of CSAs actually manifest for young people. And I agree very much that a social entrepreneur in Clint, wonderful, and Jason Callahan, the superintendent. But as you heard, Patty is a social entrepreneur in her own right. Her idea about let's transform how we think about scholarships, let's move them to, you know, fish a little earlier upstream, was a brilliant idea. And we were definitely willing to partner with the Wabash County Community Foundation and see what the what was there, see if there was a there there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So to use your metaphor, Benita, it sounds like the community foundations are the farm teams for the private foundations. And we're out there trying that R&D with real people and real organizations, and you're there to sort of support us. But how is it, Benita, that the board at your foundation has also had the perseverance and persistence? Because to build a field, to build a movement, it takes more than a 3-year demonstration grant, right? I mean, we're looking at 20 years since the first CSAs, as Carl said, 30 years when Michael had this brilliant idea, like poverty, well, you will not get out of poverty by income assistance alone. How has your board stayed the course?
I think a couple of things, as I mentioned earlier, very lucky that our former president, Bill White, really believes that change takes time. He used to talk about change can happen, and then a year later, it's unchanged. Something happens in your context, and to really see enduring impact, it does take time to build systems and to build the support around the changes that are being made. Progress doesn't hurt. Let's be clear about that. To see the momentum that was happening in the field, there was a period of time where it was just San Francisco and Maine, and CSAs are a long bet. It's let's do this at kindergarten, and 12, 18 years later, then we're going to have findings. And that is a long bet, and we did take a leap of faith. But I think as grant makers at this foundation, we're particularly lucky because, again, our style of grant making has been to take those leaps of faith and understand that change takes time. There were some smart people in the field as well that understood it's going to be really hard to continue raising money if we have to wait that period of time. So Dr. Elliott was one that did some interim metrics to look at what are some milestones that we can look at along the way that help us know we're on the right track, that we're making the impacts. Patty's, the research coming out of Patty's program, some phenomenal research, Patty, which I think you should mention about the impact you are having on math and reading. It's data points like that that help let you know that even after proof of concept, that you're on the right track and you're ultimately going to have the impact and get closer to that vision that you have. And then here we are now where Governor Newsom in California put almost $2 billion of ARP funds into CSAs. Huge investment, continuing the momentum in the field. And the state of Illinois just fully funded their program. So all the momentum that's continuing to happen helps reinforce us and let us know, kind of like driving down the highway, those little mile markers that we're heading in the right direction.
Well, and I also want to note on your website, the Mott Foundation based in Flint, Michigan is funding an evaluation of the San Francisco model. You're supporting the state of California, and you're funding an evaluation of the Maine initiative of the Alphonse Scholarship Fund.
And the work with Patty at the Wabash Community Foundation. Yes.
Well, and Patty, I'm reminded that a child savings account is not a one and done thing, right? I went back to look at when Eugene Lang gave his famous speech to Public School 121 in 1981. He offered all those sixth graders full college scholarships, right? And I know, Patty, at your community foundation, at the ones I've been at, many donors, they identify with scholarships. It's something they can do. And I'm curious how we talk them into a smarter, earlier investment that changes identity rather than holding out this reward when you turn 18 and you struggled with poverty your whole life. And as Eugene Lang discovered, oh, I guess I'm going to have to get involved with these kids. He didn't have CSAs in his toolkit at the time.
Yeah. Those are very good questions, because you're exactly right. Often donors come to us wanting to remember a loved one that's passed on. And through a traditional scholarship, they can sculpt and restrict, the candidates to reflect those qualities that meant so much to that individual. So that is a challenge, and that's a difficult one to overcome. However, the findings that Dr. Elliott has been producing, Benita mentioned them, children in our program are scoring higher on standardized test scores in reading and in math. We know that we're moving the needle on social emotional development. We know that our kids, our families are saving more than children that have even just a CSA but no scholarship fund. So those are the kinds of things that we do point out to donors. And in most cases, we can demonstrate that we can help the same children you want to help. We can address this same population that you're interested in if we could just do it earlier. But you are right, this is a high touch model. We make a great deal of effort to talk regularly. If we believe that if children savings accounts are to affect identity, they need to know that they have them. And so we do a lot to communicate through reports and emails and publications, et cetera, about these assets. But the other telling tale for donors is that we can point to scholarships that are intended for low-income children that go undistributed. It's because financial, just the example you're using, the financial barrier is not the only barrier. There is a need to prepare students early. for believing that they can succeed and that education is very important to their future.
Well, we'll come back to both of you later on and during the
Okay.
webinar. I want to turn to Professor Dr. Loya.
Thank
Becca
you.
Loya has an amazing portfolio of evaluations at Brandeis. I downloaded about 5 of them, Becca, and there, if we have any need to prove this thing, it seems to me the documents are there at the Institute. So with that, I want to turn it over to Professor Loya to talk a little bit about the research and where the movement has come to by today. Becca.
Thank you, Sterling. And thank you so much to the presenters who came before. You've already heard this great overview of the field from Carl and really powerful words from 2 committed and pioneering funders, Benita and Patty. So today I'm going to speak with you about the depth and the breadth of philanthropic and public funding for CSAs based on what we know from the research. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick look at what I will share with you today. I'll give you, I promise, a very, very short overview of what our study was, a snapshot of the funding sources for CSAs. So, how much public and private funding are we seeing? Then we'll take a look at public funding sources and their intended uses, and a similar look at private funding sources and their intended uses, but we'll do a little bit of a closer focus on philanthropy, since that is our primary audience today. A very quick look at in-kind support and close out with a few lessons. Next slide, please. So the Asset Funders Network, or AFN, has contracted with my team to conduct a series of research projects related to CSA funding. And one of these projects has been an approximately semi-annual survey of CSA funding sources and amounts. We are currently wrapping up our data collection on the 2021 funding, and unfortunately those data are not quite ready to share with you today. So today I'll be speaking about our last CSA funding report, the one that focused on funding in 2019. And I just want to give a few notes as we think about 2019. We collected these data, of course, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. At that moment, we knew the pandemic was likely to change things in the field, but didn't quite yet know how that would look. So we set out to collect very detailed information about 2019 funding, both to see how things had grown and changed since the previous study, which was focused on 2017, and to allow us to look at how things have shifted during the pandemic. So in this way, the 2019 survey serves as a bit of a baseline. So today I'll focus on that 2019 survey as the most recent detailed look at CSA funding and the landscape thereof. Next slide, please. So we reached out to 106 CSA programs across the US that were either active or being planned in 2019. And 77 of these responded to the survey and had at least some funding and or in-kind support to report for that year. And today I'm going to focus primarily on the financial support. Next slide, please. So we'll move over to an overview of the funding. And as you can see on the next slide, the headline here is that CSA programs, please skip to the next slide. The CSA programs received nearly $57 million for use in 2019. And this does represent about a $17 million in real growth from the previous survey in 2017. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the origins of these $57 million in funding for CSAs. Were they from public or private sources? So we'll start by looking at the chart on the left. So you can see that 2/3 of these dollars, so that's $38.4 million, were from public or governmental sources. And about $18.5 million were from private sources. But then when we look at the chart on the right, we see that although public sources collectively provide greater dollar amounts, private philanthropic organizations make up the vast majority of funders for CSAs in 2019. So we had 187 unique private institutions supporting CSAs and 32 public institutions. So that means we have a relatively small number of public funders providing a large amount of funding. And much of this is due to big statewide opt-out programs, such as those that provide a seed deposit at birth for every child born in a state, for instance. Next slide, please. Now let's look at this another way. So looking at the number of programs that receive different kinds of funding, here's what we see. In the dark red, 17% of programs are entirely publicly funded. In the light blue, 55% of programs rely entirely on private funding. And then in the yellow, we see more than a quarter of programs, 28%, receive both private and public support. So if we think about the share of programs that receive at least some private support, we're seeing that 83% of CSA programs have at least some private funding. Another thing to note here is that CSAs tend to receive more than one source of financial support. So a typical CSA receives 3.1 sources of funding. This may be a combination of private and or public sources. So we're not usually seeing just one funder providing all the support. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. And we will start by looking at public funding sources and how those funds are used. Next slide, please. We can see here that state governments and state 529 plans were the two largest public funders in this year. Between them, they contributed $28.3 million to CSAs. The other thing to notice here is that very small fraction of funding from federal government in 2019. There was only $37,000 reported from federal sources in that year. This is certainly something that we expect to change, at least temporarily, with the American Rescue Plan or ARPA funds. Next slide, please. So I'm going to temporarily step outside the CSA Funding Survey for a moment, just to give a glimpse into the future and what we expect to see with those ARPA funds. So for the years 2021 through 2024, we expect to see the federal government contributions grow dramatically because a number of states, counties, and even little local programs have allocated ARPA funds to their CSAs. So just put a few confirmed examples on here. California allocated $1.8 billion to CSAs, which will be deployed between this year and 2024. Washtenaw County in Michigan allocated nearly $3 million in ARP funding to a new CSA program. And finally, to give you an example of a small CSA program that is also making use of ARPA funds, Providence Promise is a small high-touch CSA in Rhode Island, and they have been awarded $2 million from Rhode Island's ARPA funds. So this is very exciting. We're going to see a big bump in federal funding, but this bump is likely to be temporary because those ARPA funds must be used by fall of 2024. Next slide, please. So we are going to step back into the funding survey data. And here, let's take a look at the intended uses of public funds. So as you likely know, some funds are provided for general use, but most funding streams are tied to a specific purpose. And in our survey, we asked respondents to tell us for each grant that they received, what were the intended uses, and then how much money was associated with each intended use. And so what you can see here is that the vast majority of public dollars, $35 million, go toward incentives for families. And in fact, between 2017 and 2019, public dollars for incentives increased by about $31 million. So we saw a big boost in public dollars going into incentives. As we can see in the tiny dark blue piece of the pie, only a very small amount of public dollars go toward evaluation, program development, and program expansion. And that sort of medium shade of blue is education, outreach, and administration. That's about $2 million. Next slide, please. So if we zoom into those public dollars for incentives, let's take a look at what kinds of incentives are being used, or public funds are being used to support. So seed deposits are the type of incentive that receives the most funding, and that's that dark red chunk at $14.9 million. And this does make sense. We know from Prosperity Now's research that the vast majority of kids with CSAs get seed deposits because this is a very common feature in the large CSA programs. Matches on family deposits, that's that medium blue, are the second most common type of incentive funded by public dollars. You can see the yellow chunk is another $10 million. These are other financial incentives, most often where the respondent didn't specify the type of incentive used. And very little money, only $150,000 going for benchmark incentives. Those are the kinds of incentives that are given when a child or family reaches a goal or milestone in their life. Next slide, please. So we will spend the next few minutes digging into the details about private funding sources and amounts. Next slide. So we started by showing you private funding sources, and there's a very clear picture here. You see that foundations make up a lot of the private funding for CSAs. In 2019, the total amount of private funding was $18.5 million, and of that, $11.3 million came from foundations. The next most common source of private funding was financial institutions and then individual donors. And these three categories really dwarf the other categories of private funders, although all are important. Next slide. So altogether, we had 102 foundations offering 104 grants worth those $11.3 million. And since foundations provide the largest amount of private funding, it's instructive to sort of zoom in and find out what kinds of foundations are most active in the CSA space. And so what you can see here in the dark red is that family foundations provide by far the greatest amount of funding to CSAs at $9 million. Independent and community foundations also provide substantial support. Next slide, please. And now to look at the intended uses of those private dollars. Here we've summarized how those funds are used, and you can see again that incentives for families are the most common use for private funds at $10.8 million, and followed again by education, outreach, and administration, and general use is quite common here. And again, just a tiny little sliver for evaluation, program development, and expansion. And next slide, please. Once again, just wanted to show you, because incentives for families make up such a big share of the funding, let's take a look at what kinds of incentives are being funded. And you can see that again, seed deposits are by far the most popular type of incentive that's being funded at $9.4 million. And after seed deposits, the most commonly funded type of incentive is that match on family deposits. All right, next slide, please. Today's webinar has been really focused on financial support and philanthropic support. And this usually, when we talk about philanthropy, we're talking about financial funding, but another type of support that is essential in the daily operations of CSAs all across the US is in-kind support. And by this, I mean things like staff time, data sharing, waiving fees, holding accounts, all that type of work. So I'm just going to very briefly show you a little bit about that on the next slide. And so this is just a partial snapshot of those programs that reported in-kind support and what kinds of support they received. So you can see that outreach and publicity were by far the most frequently reported type of in-kind support, and both public and private institutions provided this type of assistance to CSAs. And data sharing is another common and very essential yet perhaps underappreciated type of in-kind support that CSAs receive from partners. We do not attempt to assign a dollar value to these types of activities, but I do want to just close out the findings by emphasizing that CSA programs are really built on top of existing infrastructure across domains, including public agencies, financial institutions, nonprofit organizations, and schools. So it is really helpful, of course, to quantify the dollar amounts received in grants and donations, but this is not the whole picture of what it takes to make CSA programs run. In-kind support and cross-agency cooperation are essential, and in some ways they defy sort of simple quantification. Next slide, please. So we'll move on to some very brief lessons and future directions. Next slide. So from all these numbers that I've thrown at you today, what can we take away from this? I'll give you a few ideas. One thing is that it's important to note CSA programs are typically supported by multiple funders. So they represent this opportunity for collaboration and coming together of different partners. Another thing to highlight here is that many different types of funders support CSAs. We have really emphasized here the importance of foundations. And I have noted that even though the collective dollar amount of public investment is greater, 55% of CSAs rely exclusively on private funding, and 83% of CSAs receive at least some private funding. And I just want to note that in practice, many CSAs have been initiated by funders or have grown to scale due to new investments by funders. And philanthropy has also played a crucial role in encouraging innovation in the CSA space, such as funding additional incentives for low and moderate income families on top of existing programs. And finally, we are also seeing a strong and growing partnership between public and private funders to both start CSAs and to bring them to scale. And I think I'm running out of time, so I will just move to the next slide quickly and let you know that, give another plug that Prosperity Now will be hosting a State of the Field webinar on May 17th, where you'll be able to learn all about the growth of the field year over year. And our 2021 CSA Funding Survey will be released this fall. And my final slide just has a few links to resources and my contact information. But with that, I will turn it back over to Sterling, and thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Becca. And one quick question before we open it up to our conversation. I noticed that your Institute at Brandeis used to be called the Institute on Assets and Social Policy, and it is now called the Institute on Economic and Racial Equity. Could you explain the reason for the name change?
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't want to take the time to talk too much about our institute, but we, in fact, spent more than 15 years as the Institute on Assets and Social Policy. And we do continue, as we changed our focus to more explicitly state really the work that we've always done. We've always been devoted to studying family economic well-being, wealth inequalities, and asset-based solutions to address poverty and inequality. So that's always been the heart of what we've done, but we changed the name in order to sort of make that more clear to audiences. Many people didn't understand if they weren't in the assets field, what do assets have to do with things, or they might not understand what social policy is. So we've also recently gone through a change of director, and we took that opportunity to sort of specify the name. And it was hard, it's always hard to change your name, but I have found that people seem to have more clarity on the work that we do and that we've always done now that we have changed the name. So I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to bring Benita and Patty back in, and Carl. We've got a couple of quick questions in the chat. Marcy's
really kind of building those aspirations.
So I want to come back to Becca's statistics on public funding vis-a-vis private funding. ARPA looks like it will bring some temporary funds, not small, but I recall what intrigued me with IDAs and now CSAs was a report that Prosperity Now would put out every year on how the federal budget is so helpful to middle-class families to support saving for college, to support saving for retirement, to support owning a home. And as the last report, Carl, I don't know, it was $60 billion of support for middle-class families to build assets. And I'm not seeing that kind of money on the other side in Becca's statistics to say, okay, I've benefited from all those fabulous public policies, didn't realize how much subsidy I was getting from the federal government. I didn't know I was on welfare, but we seem so reluctant to support working and poor families with the same amount of money to help them build assets. Is there Is there some hope that public dollars would increase in the future? I don't know who I should point that to. Carl?
Oh yeah, no, I think it's with my former colleagues at Prosperity Now, we often tried to make this case on Capitol Hill that we should really, reallocate some of these, as you said, vast billions of dollars of subsidies for folks with assets, reallocate some of that to folks with little or no assets. I think it's in the political circles is more difficult conversation because it's a little bit more of appears to be zero sum, but I think certainly from a justice perspective, I think we really need to democratize those asset building subsidies and make sure everyone has the same incentive to grow assets, not just a few.
I would like to go a little deeper into the 2-generation impacts of CSAs, which you talked about at March 29th a little bit, but the notion of 2-generation strategies wasn't very popular or maybe articulated enough in the field. We helped create the Ascend program at Aspen when my colleague Ann Mosley and Marjorie Sims migrated to DC, and now suddenly 2-generation strategies are everywhere, and we wonder why welfare reform might have helped working moms go back to work, but we totally ignored the kids. Or we fight for quality childcare, but mom has still got a low non-livable wage. So I know that CSAs are having a powerful effect on adult behavior too. Could you talk about that, Patty or Benita?
Patty, if you want to start.
The work that Willie Elliott is doing is demonstrating that the parents' expectation of their children in terms of educational attainment is increased. I'm not sure what that mechanic is, but I believe that statistic is borne out under several different programs. It was found in ours as well as others. I think, Benita, you probably know beyond Wabash County about the field in that.
The state of Oklahoma Seed Random Assignment Control Group found the same finding, that parental expectations were significantly higher for the families who had children's savings accounts than those without them. And parental expectations is one of the trifecta in education that influences outcomes for young people. So if we're having an impact on parental expectations, we're hopefully having an impact, as the research says, ultimately on educational outcomes for kids.
Well, and Benita, the other thing is that maternal mental health, it's also shown as in the SEED Oklahoma research that really has improved mothers' mental health as they sort of have hope for their children, but also sort of see that hope being made concrete with the real investments in their future.
Sterling, I want to just raise up another point of the dual directionality here. When we did IDAs and we did the random assignment there, one of the findings we had anecdotally were a number of the parents that had IDAs said they wanted to open accounts or have for their children and get their children saving early. So these effects go in both directions. And we talk a lot in the education sphere about whole child. You could extrapolate that and call it whole family with these 2-gen impacts that we're trying to have and see. And then Carl is probably the best one to speak about one more thing. Is there sort of the next wave of innovation happening in the CSA field are some projects coming online, St. Paul. I think someone tried it in Stockton, California, maybe was going to do it. The guaranteed income programs plus CSA components. Carl, if you want to just say something about those, and those are very exciting sort of new avenue in the field.
Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that, Benita. Yeah, so certainly in St. Paul, where they've got a child savings account program, and they've also got a pilot with UBI, and all the families recruited for the UBI program are already parents of students who've set up a CSA through their CSA program. So they've made an explicit link between basic income and savings. There's another really interesting program in Jackson, Mississippi called Springboard Opportunities, and that actually addresses another question that was in the chat about sort of housing organizations and sort of and wealth building. So Springboard Opportunities works with low-income moms in a housing community. And so all the kids in this community have a CSA set up while they're living in this affordable housing community. So it's a very much again, linked to basic income, housing, and building wealth, which are important connections to make, certainly for all families, but in particular for lower income families.
Which then just drives us to one last point, that children's savings accounts, as passionate as I am about them, they are not a silver bullet. They don't solve these problems by themselves. They are best and most impactful, I believe, embedded into other initiatives or layered onto other initiatives. That's where we see the most momentum and the most progress being made. The way Patty embedded it into other education initiatives that the Community Foundation and the broader community were doing, like the YMCA, and to Carl's point, universal basic income and other programs. This is, in my mind, the next frontier for children's savings accounts.
Well, thank you, Benita and Carl, for opening that up, because I had made notes to myself about child tax credits, baby bonds, debt justice. I happen to know one of the founding donors of the Magnolia Mothers Project in Jackson. While talking with her a few months ago, she said the mothers who, and as some may know, they were invited to apply for 1 year's support, $1,000 a month for basic income for 1 year. And then they came back to the founder and said, you know, we need financial literacy training because they had money. And they said, we also need to figure out how to talk to our kids, because when we had very little, we shared everything. But now that we're saving, we have to be careful about where we spend our money. But all those things, preaching financial literacy to poor people without money seems so abstract, and now it was real. So I appreciate poverty. To me, is like extra gravity. You don't reach escape velocity because one brilliant program, as Benita said, I have a child savings account, I have hope, I'm future oriented, but I can't pay the rent. It's like, okay, that's where the child tax credit comes in, right? That's where a UBI program comes in. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, you're absolutely right. CSAs are a bright light in terms of an identity towards the future, agency, imagination, aspiration, but by themselves, necessary but not sufficient.
Necessary but not sufficient. I agree completely. Couldn't agree more. I think of them as a force multiplier in this work, and that's where we get the impact. And I couldn't have said it better, Serling. This is about, we used to have a saying early on in the CSA field and in the IDA field that assets change minds. And so the point you made about families saying, oh, well, we need financial education now, it does change the way you look at your life and brings a future orientation that you may not have when you're struggling paycheck to paycheck and all the difficult decisions that come with scarcity. So that's an extremely important point to raise up.
So you put scarcity in quotes, Benita, because that's the title of one of my favorite books.
And I love that book. I didn't want to take time and go there, but I'm glad you lifted that up. Scarcity was a great book.
And you know, when Eldar Shafir and Sendel Mullинathan wrote that book, and we all read it at the Kellogg Foundation, you know, they didn't talk about poverty in that book until the second or third chapter.
Exactly.
They got the reader's attention on when you're struggling with scarcity in your life, your decision making becomes narrower and narrower, right?
That's right.
Then I think by chapter 3, they say, now let's talk about poor people. And the reader now can understand when you live with chronic financial scarcity, you can't pay someone to clean the house or walk the dog or take care of your child. It's all on you. And that's why CSAs were, I think, a profound stake in the ground to say, you can have hope for your future. But to Patty's point, it seems to me the scaffolding and Becca's slides, we're not doing enough to match the continued investment of families to feel like their agency is building this momentum, but they need consistent inputs and reinforcements. And that, you know, it seems to me like just having a CSA at birth will not be the answer to your future, right?
Not solely, but
And the other
definitely
connection,
a part-
Sterling,
definitely a part of it.
yeah. Well, the other connection is you mentioned there's no silver bullet, right? And I think there was a question in the chat about, how do you bridge that gap between CSA and sort of the need to pay for college down the road, right? And so another important partnership that's been formed in a number of communities, and actually, we should put this in the chat. Martha Cantor, who leads the College Promise campaign, is leading the work to develop promise programs around the country to pay the full either tuition or cost of college for kids that get there. A number of CSA programs and promise programs have actually partnered together. It's like that line from Casablanca about the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The CSA programs can sort of like instill that inspiration and the sort of the identity, as Patty talked about, that in some ways college promise programs can't always do with that promise of funds down the line. On the other hand, even with Patty's program, $1,000, or in Maine, $500 at birth, it's not going to pay even the full cost of 4 years public, right? Which is probably as much as $10,000 a year. And so these two programs work together well to really bring, instill the inspiration, but then also help to pay those significant costs for 4-year college. So that's an important partnership. I also need to give a shout out. I just saw in the chat, Bob Friedman must be on the call here today. So Bob posted in the chat. Bob, none of us would be here without you, Bob. So you've been an inspiration. You probably could have been here for speaking for all of us today. So thanks for joining us and for really, having the vision to get this field off the ground and to raise the philanthropic dollars needed to get the demonstration going in the beginning. So, yeah.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob. So we're coming close to our time, but I want to leave time for any more thoughts or questions. I'd love to ask, what is the ideal CSA program, and what is it wrapped in terms of it? Does it make sense that CSA should start at birth when you've got that new parent thinking about their baby's future? I know James Coleman's report in the 60s said the two most important things for a child's success was mother's education and her hopes and aspirations for her child. It seems like CSAs make those hopes and aspirations totally possible, but not completely inevitable between birth and 18. Is there an ideal program you have in your mind, Patty or Becca, from your looking at the field, or Carl? If you had a magic wand, and as you said, it would be accompanied by other sorts of support, some more immediate.
Perfect CSA. Right now, we're only doing 4 through 8. I could see us, there's avenues to go younger or to go later to be able to expand the program all the way through. The other ideal is partnerships. I would love to see our local government. I'm listening to Becca talk about other municipalities and government leaders using ARPA funds. That's not our case. I'm envious of that. I would love to see us into the county budgets, even in a small amount, but where the county, and we have more partners that are embracing the value of education and taking care of our youngest citizens. I think that would be a wonderful accomplishment to move for.
I was also intrigued with Washtenaw County's big investment. I'm spoken with Ginger about this. What is the power of the social capital when everybody in your community has a CSA and everybody's talking about, I put in $10 this week, and in Raising a Reader, we'd like to say everybody walks around and says, what's your baby's favorite book? And like, when did you last put money into your CSA, right? It's like it becomes a cultural norm rather than I got lucky, I went to the right school and got a CSA. So I'd love to see Washington County or other place-based initiatives try to build the culture of college going in CSAs, as well as sharing books with infants and toddlers.
Yeah, so that takes what I was going to say about the ideal. One of the ideals that I would see in a CSA program design is, when possible, to do an opt-out model, because that allows exactly what you just articulated, Sterling. So San Francisco kindergarten to college, to use an example, every child who enters kindergarten automatically is enrolled and has their account seeded. And then the really cool thing is, A, you maximize your participation that way. You don't leave out the people who we know have the highest barriers to enrollment. But B, they are able to incorporate lessons about the CSA into their public school curriculum from kindergarten all the way on, and use examples in math, in social studies, all the way through. You know, all of you have an account and you have at least $50 in there. What can we learn, you know, in X, Y, and Z field? And it's quite powerful. So that's definitely on my wish list for ideal CSA design.
And
Well,
also too, Sterling, I think there's some good examples. There's some good examples of youth savings programs where, you know, youth who have an account are actually like working, some can save their own money, powerful impacts for youth who are getting close to college. But I think for my money, if I had to do it one way, I think the starting early with dollars growing over time and building those aspirations from an early age is probably, for me, would be the way to go.
And
Well,
I would echo all of those. We've done a lot of work, like I said, on figuring out what does best practice look like. The field is still innovating, and I think we'll learn more from the new programs like St. Paul. But I would echo everything Carl and Patty and Becca said, and I would add the incentives matter. What Patty tested and tried is showing that the incentives can influence behavior, and I realize the research literature is a bit divided on the impact of incentives, but what we're seeing out of Wabash is that they do matter and they can shape and influence behavior. And so I think that would be an important element for a program for me as well. And then the progressive aspects. I think it's extremely important that you have everybody in the program in a system, because we already know that the way we're structured is that those who have will do for their children, and those who don't have, their children get left out. So this is the importance of universalism, so that everyone all children can be covered, but then we do targeted and do more for kids who have less. And that would be an important element of a program for me as well.
Yeah. Well, I can see the, go ahead, Carl.
I was gonna say there were a couple of good questions in the chat I don't think we got to. One about, I wonder whether Patty or Benita might comment on this. Like, one person asked, how, as a funder, how long should they think about investing? How long do they need to sort of, what kind of time frame to invest in to get a program going?
Boy, we have been blessed by the Mott Foundation's long-term commitment, and it took, you know, it took a year at least to get started, to work with our teachers and our school systems to develop the program. We have plans to endow the program, so we don't see it going away. And again, if you start small with a single third grade room and a single building, and then build upon it, perhaps it wouldn't feel so onerous and feel like you're making a potentially a commitment that you're worried about sustaining. But I think it's a long term. I mean, I don't anticipate this going away. Children will need this type of support. It's a tool that we want all generations to have.
I can see
Charlie,
we're
it's
going to
a
run out of time.
fantastic question. Oh, I'm sorry, Sterling, I cannot respond. I don't want to take us off time.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Charlie, it's a fantastic question. I think there's a lot that goes into it. Your donor intent, what's the mission of your foundation? What are your current priorities? Being from the Mott Foundation and the way we invest, we're long-term funders. So I would say as long as we can, because again, change doesn't happen in 2- and 3-year program plans. But the other side of it is I'm also a big believer in the fact that we have other value add beyond our financial resources. And so if you are engaging other funders or helping engage other partners to a program, that's a way that you can sustain your engagement while at the same time maybe not tying up your resources forever. And then the other thing I would say is it also depends on what level you're funding, looking for the things that other funders can't do. Because we're Mott and we fund nationally, we've been able to do infrastructure, things that the Community Foundation of Wabash can't do, that have helped grow the field nationally. We're less focused on funding individual operations of programs. And so it's also looking at how do we all work together across philanthropy to help this field grow and continue making progress.
Amen. Thank you. Benita, Patty, Becca, Carl, I know we're running out of time. The poll is up there. And I need to turn it over to Miriam from the campaign for grade level reading to sort of wrap us up and give us a preview of upcoming events. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sterling, and thanks everybody for a fabulous session. I'm happy to pop in here quickly to tell you about yet another resource in this really resource-rich session. One of the things that this session underscored for us all is the wide range of funders who can play a role in CSAs. So Benita and Patty talked about their foundations. Patty talked about the individual fund holders at the Community Foundation, and Becca's data told us a whole lot more about the wide range of funders. And so it was a no-brainer to include CSAs and really feature them in a new toolkit I want you to know about. This is going to launch in May. It was developed with our partner, the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. This particular toolkit is geared to individual and family donors and their advisors, the kinds of philanthropists who have no shortage of giving opportunities, but they really want some guideposts to help identify high impact opportunities that they can access readily. And CSAs really present that opportunity. We also know that these toolkits, will be the latest in a series that this center has released. These toolkits are also very useful for foundation program officers, United Way staff, and others who find the information really, really helpful. This primer and suite of tools will focus on helping young children recover learning and accelerate gains, the kind of thing that we're at the campaign all focused on. There'll be a free webinar that will introduce the toolkit on May 25th. Sarah has dropped or will be dropping a link into the chat where you can register for the webinar. And if you register for the webinar, you don't necessarily have to attend. You certainly are welcome to, but you'll get an announcement when the toolkit is released. So I hope that you'll share this information with others in your network. And with that, I'll turn it back to Sterling for the very last word.
Oh my goodness, I just so many more questions and good ideas bubbling up here at the end. I just want to thank the campaign for grade level reading. I think what the campaign has really done has assembled what I would call all the social determinants of education. Much like the social determinants of health, there are many things that contribute to a child's success or their ability to escape poverty, even though they're born into it. And the campaign, I think, with the long-term goal of grade level reading has availed itself. We've heard from Parent Nation, we've heard of book harvesting, we've heard of CSAs. And I just want to thank the campaign for continuing to support the field across this wide array of things we're working on to support kids and families here in this country. And I want to thank everybody for attending. Thanks so much.
And I'm here to wrap up from the campaign to just remind everybody about our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Today at 3 o'clock, there's a Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinar, taking stock and looking forward principles on K-3 learning. There's another Learning Loss Recovery webinar a week from today about starting early state investments. And there's another one of those on Tuesday, May 3rd around closing the digital equity gap. And finally, a Crucible of Practice webinar will run on Tuesday, May 10th, CGLR Communities and Strive Together. Please plan to join us for any or all of these. If you register, if you know you can't make it, but you like the content, register and you will receive the follow-up with all of the resources, as you will from this event today. I want to thank everybody for joining us. So grateful for the participation and the lively conversation. We hope to see you at future CGL webinars. Bye-bye.